Frontiers are something that change the world. They can be people, places, ideas, events, and more. One frontier many people know about is the sinking of the Titanic.
Titanic. Beyond the sinking.
The Titanic was built in Belfast, Ireland in 1909. It was constructed by the Harland, Wolff, and White Star Line companies. Using 3 million rivets and 3,000 workers, the Titanic was finished in 3 years.
People viewed the Titanic as a safe, unsinkable ship. The ship was one of the largest of its time, so the workers could have seen to be experimenting with it. On April 14, 1912, the Titanic collided with an iceberg, which slashed a 300-foot gash into the hull of the ship. Consequently, the ship broke into 2 pieces, leaving the ship vertical for some time before the ship ultimately plunged to the bottom of the ocean floor.
Forgive me. I did the sum in my head, and with the number of lifeboats times the capacity you mentioned, forgive me, but it seems that there are not enough for everyone aboard.
About half, actually. Rose, you miss nothing, do you? In fact, I put in these new type davits, which can take an extra row of boats inside this one. But it was thought, by some, that the deck would look too cluttered. So I was overruled.
A waste of deck space as it is in an unsinkable ship.
Most people know that not everyone got into a lifeboat on the Titanic. See, there had been originally 64 lifeboats, but that number had been halved. The builders worried that the ships would block the first-class passengers' view. There were only enough lifeboats to fit about 53% of the boat passengers, and that would have been if every lifeboat filled accordingly.
The crew did not know the safe amount of passengers to place in the lifeboats before it capsized, leaving some of them to only fill the lifeboats halfway. There was a lack of training on the ship. The lifeboat safety was also canceled the morning it set sail.
The common sense thing to do when your ship starts to sink would be to call for help. Captain Smith of the Titanic tried to do that, but his calls were not received. The wireless operator had switched off their radio system and didn't get any of the distress signals Smith was sending him.
The Titanic was a frontier because it created a pathway for new and improved ship design and maritime laws that would prevent future disasters and protect future passengers and crew members.
To begin, the new ship designs got implemented after the Titanic sank. The design of ships after the sinking was made more sturdy with a higher watertight compartment and roof over it to prevent spilling into the other compartments.
The ship's bottoms were stretched to create 2 holes to prevent cracking in 2. Future ships would have a decreased amount of sulfur in the steel so that the hull wouldn't be as brittle.
People learned that in the future they need better training, better tools, and more efficient backup systems in the event of an emergency. In fact, aboard the Titanic, the officers did not have enough flashlights or binoculars.
Ship designs were mandated to include enough lifeboats for all passengers on board, despite how it would make the ship deck look. This goes to show that the ship designs have been solely focused on safety rather than the actual look of the ship. Nowadays, the crew aboard ships is required to have experience in lifeboat training. They are required to train at least once a month. The people on the ship have to be safe. We don't want another tragedy in our hands. Another thing that happened in regard to the sinking of the Titanic was the creation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, had its first meeting on November 12, 1913. In January 1914, the new organization was formed. The organization had 14 chapters of rules. This organization helps the ships have an extra set of rules that are just for them. The rules are particular to ensure safety. The Titanic needed to sink for new policies to be formed. Today, the laws are better and more equipped for the current ship.
Another thing that improved because of the sinking of the Titanic was the Radio Act of 1912.
On the Titanic, they had difficulties with communication. The radios on other ships were turned off for the night, so when the Titanic tried to send signals, nobody received them because the radios were off. This became a huge problem that needed to be fixed.
36 days after the Titanic sank, the Radio Act of 1912 took place. The act stated that any sea vessel must have a 24-hour radio system. This would ensure that ships could contact one another in case of emergency.
The Radio Act helps improve close communication between sea vessels. This shows that the crew runs the radio system is very familiar with the communication system. The Radio Act of 1912 is yet another example of change brought about by the sinking of the Titanic.
The night the Titanic sank, the lookout crew was not provided with the correct tools to fully look for anything in the distance. The Belfast Telegraph explains that the crew did not see the iceberg until they were close to it because they were not provided binoculars. This was a problem that was resolved by the creation of the International Ice Patrol.
The International Ice Patrol, also known as the IIP, was founded in April 1914. In conjunction with the United States Coast Guard, 17 other nations' officers that represent the IIP work night and day to search for the presence of icebergs all throughout the Atlantic and subarctic oceans.
Now, everyone is prepared for what is ahead. Ships can navigate easier to make sure that no disaster strikes. As you can see, the International Ice Patrol wouldn't have been founded if the Titanic never sank. The sinking of the Titanic pushed this helpful organization to be created.
The next thing that changed because of the Titanic was the creation of the Jones Act, also known as the Merchant Marine Act.
According to Scott Christ, a federal law was passed called the Jones Act or Merchant Marine Act. This law allowed the employee or person on a ship to be paid back for losses of wages and recovery of injuries.
This had a huge impact on future sailors and passengers to protect themselves in the event of emergencies that could bring about loss or physical injury. This was another improvement made after the sinking of the Titanic. We interviewed James Myers from the Titanic attraction in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. We asked, would you consider the sinking of the Titanic a frontier in history, and why?
He replied with, I truly do believe that the Titanic was a frontier in many ways. Here are some of those changes.
He answered with, ships were required to have enough lifeboats to accommodate everyone on the ship. Lifeboat drills were mandatory so that everyone knew where they were supposed to go. And all crew members were trained in the loading and lowering of lifeboats.
He kept going with, there was to be communications on ships 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All rockets fired at sea were now considered distress signals regardless of color. Better training was required of radio operators, and the International Ice Patrol was established to watch for icebergs in Iceberg Alley, and is still in operation today.
However, some people can look at the disaster of the Titanic as a terrible, world-renowned disaster that hit all the front pages of the newspapers in its time.
Some could argue that the loss of over 1,500 passengers, the breaking up of families, and the loss of world goods could only be seen in a negative light. A terrible accident that nothing good could come.
In conclusion, the idea that the sinking of the Titanic could only be seen as negative and deadly was proven false by the creation of new maritime laws, safety groups, and improved ship design that would be a frontier of safety in the travel of maritime vessels.
New shipbuilding requirements, lifeboat training requirements, the creation of safety organizations such as SOLAS and the International Ice Patrol, the Radio Act of 1912, and the Jones Act all contributed to safer travels for crew and passengers and for fewer maritime disasters.
One example of these improvements would be the sinking of the Britannic in 1916. A sister ship to the Titanic, the Britannic implemented several structural changes to the ship, and other communication laws were in place. Therefore, they were more prepared for this emergency, only having 30 out of 1,066 passengers perish. This was a great improvement in the saving of lives when compared to the Titanic. When one books a Carnival cruise or sets sail from Port Canaveral, no one thinks about the terror of drowning from an emergency in the middle of the ocean.
Because of all the improvements made to maritime safety after the sinking of the Titanic, others can set sail safely with peace of mind to enjoy vacations and arrive at their intended destination.
Although the loss was many and people perished, the future of maritime safety and the frontier of new laws and organizations would change history.
Unfortunately, although many lost their lives, they helped to save lives in the future. The Titanic taught many lessons that are still useful today.
This frontier forever changed the world.